There's this moment that happens in every person's life where they realize they're stronger than they ever thought they'd need to be. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in March when my boss, a man who had mentored me, praised me, told me I was the future of the company, looked me in the eye and said, "We're going to have to let you go." I was 7 months pregnant. I had just closed a $12 million deal for the company. I was about to become partner, and I was being fired. This is the story of what happened after that. This is the story of how I took that humiliation, that rage, that sense of injustice, and I turned it into something that would eventually buy the company that fired me. This is the story of how I came back to the place that destroyed me, not to destroy it back, but to transform it, to remake it into something better, to prove, without saying a word, exactly what I was capable of. Before we go further, I want to know, where are you? Are you someone who's been discriminated against at work? Are you a woman who's wondered if your ambitions were even possible in an environment designed by and for men? Are you watching this because you need to know that there's a path forward when everything feels like it's collapsing? Because if you are, you're in the right place. Stay with me. My name is Victoria Miles, and I'm 42 years old now. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I run a venture capital firm with a portfolio of more than $200 million. But that's now. Let me tell you about who I was before all of this happened. I grew up in a middle-class family in Colorado. My parents weren't wealthy, but they were ambitious. My father worked his way up from a sales position to become the regional manager of a pharmaceutical distribution company. My mother was a nurse who went back to school at 40 to become a healthcare administrator. They both believed that work was how you proved yourself, that your career was the measure of your worth. I internalized that message completely. I went to the University of Colorado, got my degree in business with a minor in finance, and immediately got hired by a company called Meridian Capital Group. MCD, we called it. They were a boutique investment firm focused on tech and biotech startups. They were growing rapidly, and they hired me as an analyst. I was 23 years old, and I thought I had the world figured out. MCD was an incredible place to work. At least it seemed that way at the beginning. It was a tight-knit team of about 40 people. Everyone was young, ambitious, and hungry for success. The office was open concept, very collaborative. The pay was excellent. The opportunities to move up seemed limitless. And the culture was intense. We worked long hours. We talked about work constantly. We went out for drinks after work and talked about work some more. This company wasn't just our job, it was our identity. It was who we were. I thrived in that environment. I was good at what I did. I had an intuition about companies, which ones would succeed, which ones had real potential, which ones were going to fail despite good marketing. My boss, Richard Chun, noticed this. Richard was in his late 40s, extremely successful, had made millions in his career. He became my mentor. He taught me how to read financial statements, how to ask the right questions in due diligence meetings, how to negotiate with founders, how to think about risk and return. Richard was also a man who had built his entire career on the idea that business had no room for sentiment, no room for personal life, no room for anything other than the work. He had been married 3 times. He barely saw his children. But he was phenomenally successful, and he wanted to pass that success on to his protégés. Over the next 4 years, I moved up quickly, from analyst to senior analyst, from senior analyst to investment manager. I was making decisions about which companies MCD would fund. I was meeting with entrepreneurs and investors. I was traveling constantly to San Francisco, New York, Boston, wherever the deals were. I was working 60, sometimes 70-hour weeks. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. This was my identity. This was proof that I was valuable. By the time I was 27 years old, I was one of the most successful investment managers at MCD. I had identified and invested in 3 companies that had exited at significant returns. I had a reputation as someone who was smart, aggressive, and absolutely committed to the work. And I had completely sacrificed any semblance of a personal life to get there. Then I met Emmanuel. Emmanuel worked at one of the biotech companies that MCD had invested in. He was their chief medical officer.
brilliant, kind.
Someone who actually had a life outside of work. We met at a conference and he asked me to dinner. I almost said no because I had a deal I was supposed to be analyzing that night. But something made me say yes. That dinner turned into a relationship. That relationship turned into something serious very quickly. For the first time in my adult life, I had something outside of work that mattered to me. I had someone who reminded me that there was a world beyond the office. Someone who made me want to have a life outside of my career. When Emmanuel asked me to marry him, I said yes without hesitation. We got married in a small ceremony. My colleagues from MCD were there, of course. Richard gave a toast about how proud he was of me and how he knew marriage would make me even more focused on my career. I remember thinking that was a weird thing to say, but I brushed it off. For about 6 months, I tried to have it all. I tried to be the ambitious, committed investment manager and also be a good wife. I tried to maintain the same level of work intensity while also coming home at reasonable hours. And it was working, sort of. Marcus was understanding. He knew that my career meant everything to me. He knew that I had spent years building something at MCD. And then I found out I was pregnant. I was stunned. We hadn't been actively trying to get pregnant, but we also hadn't been preventing it. I took the test and I stared at those 2 pink lines for probably 5 minutes before I could even process what I was seeing. And then I felt this overwhelming rush of emotions.
Fear, joy,
uncertainty. And underneath it all, a voice in my head that whispered, "This is going to change everything." I didn't tell Richard immediately. I wanted to process it first. I want to figure out what this meant for my career, my trajectory at MCD, my partnership track. I spent weeks thinking about how to manage the pregnancy, how to not let it derail my career momentum. I researched maternity leave policies. I calculated how much time I could take off without falling behind. I was already, at that point, trying to minimize the impact of my pregnancy on my professional life. When I finally told Richard, I framed it as a positive thing. I said, "I wanted to give you a heads up, but I want you to know that this won't affect my work. I'll take a brief maternity leave, maybe 6 weeks, and then I'll be back full-time. I'm not letting anything derail my partnership track." And Richard's response was exactly what I needed to hear. He said, "Congratulations, Victoria. This is wonderful. Don't worry about anything. We'll figure it out. Your job will be here when you get back. You're too valuable to us." And I believed him. I genuinely believed that having a baby wasn't going to threaten my position at MCD. I was so naive. Things started changing almost immediately after I announced my pregnancy. It was subtle at first. I'd walk into meetings and conversations would stop. People who had always sought out my opinion would suddenly seem less interested in what I had to say. Deals that I would normally be involved in started being handled by others. Richard would find reasons why my input wasn't necessary. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that it was hormones, pregnancy brain, everything I'd heard about the emotional challenges of being pregnant. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the way Richard looked at me now. Not with pride or mentorship. With something else. Something that looked like calculation. At 6 months pregnant, we closed a deal. A huge deal. A biotech company that had incredible potential. It was the kind of deal that defined careers. The kind of deal that was supposed to push me to partner status. I had done most of the work on this deal. I had evaluated the company, negotiated the terms, built the relationship with the founders. This was my deal. And then, in the final stages, Richard told me that he was going to handle the closing meeting with the founders. He said it was because the deal had become too high-profile, too important, and he wanted to make sure it went smoothly. He said, "You've done great work on this, Victoria, but you're going to be on leave soon. I want to make sure the client is comfortable with the final close." And I accepted that explanation. I didn't push back. I didn't realize what was happening. The deal closed. It was a massive success. And when the company announced record returns, who got credit? Richard Chun. He was quoted in the article as the key architect of the deal. My name was mentioned as investment manager Victoria Miles, who contributed to the early analysis. Contributing to the early analysis. That was my entire contribution, according to the public record. I was furious, but I also couldn't do anything about it. I was 7 months pregnant. I was having crazy hormonal mood swings. I couldn't afford to seem unstable or emotional, or anything that might confirm the narrative that pregnant women couldn't handle high-level work. So I swallowed my rage, and I said nothing. Instead, I started documenting everything. I kept records of the work I did, the meetings I attended, the decisions I made. I was building a case, even though I didn't know yet what case I was building. I was just collecting ammunition, storing it away for some future confrontation that I sensed was coming. My son was born on March 15th of that year. Perfect, healthy, beautiful. I was absolutely in love with him from the moment he was placed in my arms. His name was Lucas. And suddenly, I had something that mattered more than MCD. Something that mattered more than my career. I took my planned 6 weeks of maternity leave. And during those 6 weeks, I was home with Lucas, learning how to be a mother, dealing with sleep deprivation and postpartum recovery, and the overwhelming responsibility of caring for a tiny human. And I realized something that I think a lot of new mothers realize. I couldn't just pick up where I left off. I couldn't work 70-hour weeks anymore. I couldn't travel constantly. I couldn't live for the job. But I also knew that if I said that to anyone at MCD, my career would be over. The narrative would be that I had gotten distracted by motherhood, that I wasn't serious about my work anymore, that I was going to choose my kid over the company. So I told myself I could do both. I told myself I would be back at full capacity. I told myself I would figure out how to make it work. 6 weeks after Lucas was born, I went back to work. I arranged for childcare. I pumped breast milk in the bathroom at the office while pretending like everything was normal. And I walked back into MCD as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The company looked at me differently now. The partners looked at me differently. Richard looked at me differently. I was no longer the ambitious, single-minded investment professional. I was the woman with a baby. The woman who had a divided attention. The woman who might leave early because of childcare issues. The woman who might not be available when deals came up because she had a family. For 2 weeks, I tried to make it work. I came to the office early. I stayed late. I didn't mention Lucas unless absolutely necessary. I acted like the pregnancy and the baby and motherhood were just minor interruptions in my real life, which was MCD. And then Richard called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember walking into that office and feeling like something was wrong. There was something in Richard's body language that told me this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. He had papers on his desk. Legal documents. He looked uncomfortable and determined at the same time. He said, "Victoria, sit down. We need to talk about your future with MCD." And I sat down, and my heart started racing because I could already sense what was coming. He said, "We've been doing some restructuring. We're evaluating every position to make sure we have the right fit for where the company is going. And we've decided that your position might not be the right fit anymore." I said, "What does that mean?" And Richard said, "It means we're going to have to let you go. We're offering you a severance package, 3 months' salary, your health insurance through the end of the year, a positive reference." I couldn't process what he was saying. I had just come back from maternity leave. I had brought in a $12 million deal. I was supposed to be on the partner track. And now I was being fired.
Fired.
Not laid off. Fired. The implication was clear. I wasn't performing. I wasn't cutting it. I had become a liability. I asked him why. I said, "Richard, I've been here for 4 years. I've generated tremendous returns for this company. My deal closed 3 months ago. Why are you firing me?" And Richard looked uncomfortable. He said, "This isn't a reflection on your past performance. It's about moving forward. We need someone in this position who can commit fully to the company. Someone who doesn't have competing priorities." There it was. The real reason. Competing priorities. Code for, "You have a baby now and we don't think you can handle this job and a baby at the same time." Never mind that I had already arranged childcare. Never mind that I had come back full-time. Never mind that nothing in my work had changed except that now I had a child. the pregnancy, and the baby had changed how they saw me. And now I was disposable. I said, "This is pregnancy discrimination. This is illegal." And Richard said, "We're not firing you because you're pregnant or because you had a baby. We're firing you because the company needs someone with full commitment. If you're interested in discussing this further, we have legal counsel available." And just like that, the door was closed. The possibility of any negotiation was closed. The only way forward was to take the severance or fight. And I was exhausted.
I was sleep-deprived.
I had a 2-month-old baby at home. I didn't have the energy for a legal fight. So I took the severance. I signed the papers. And I left MCD for the last time. The first 3 months after I was fired, I was devastated. Not just professionally, though that was certainly part of it. I was emotionally destroyed. I had given everything to that company, and they had thrown me away the moment I became a mother. It felt personal. It felt like a betrayal. I spent a lot of time at home with Lucas, trying to figure out what came next. Marcus was supportive, but he also had to go to work. We had expenses. My severance was helping, but it wouldn't last forever. I needed to figure out my next move. And I realized something during those months at home. I had time to think.
Real time.
Time that I hadn't had in years. Time to evaluate my life, my career, my priorities. And I realized that while I loved investment work, I didn't need to work for someone else to do it. I didn't need MCD to prove my worth. I didn't need Richard Chen's approval or his mentorship. I had the skills. I had the knowledge. I had the instincts. What I needed was capital and an idea. So I started researching venture capital firms. I started reading everything I could about how VCs were structured, how they raised capital, how they made decisions. And I started thinking about what I would do differently, what I would do better, how I would create a culture that didn't destroy women who had families, how I would build something that was about more than just making money, something that was about creating meaningful companies and investing in real innovation. When my severance ran out after 3 months, I did something that most people in my position wouldn't have done. I didn't look for another job at another investment firm. I started my own firm. I called it Miles Capital. I mortgaged the house Marcus and I had just bought. I borrowed money from my parents. I invested my own severance. I had just over $2 million to start with. It was terrifying. The first 2 years were brutal. I was working from a home office. I was changing diapers between investor meetings. I was pumping breast milk while reading pitch decks. I was going to investor conferences and trying to convince established venture capitalists that I had credibility, that I could manage a fund, that I knew what I was doing, all while being a single mother starting a company. A lot of people didn't believe in me. A lot of investors didn't take me seriously because I was a woman and because I was a mother. There were meetings where I had to explain my strategy, while people looked at me like I was crazy for trying to start a fund while caring for a young child. But there were also people who believed in me, who saw what I was trying to build, and wanted to be part of it. By the time Lucas was 3 years old, Miles Capital had closed its first fund. We had $45 million under management. Not huge, but respectable. And I had made some incredibly smart bets. We invested in early-stage companies that were doing innovative work in healthcare, climate tech, and biotech. Companies that other VCs had passed on. And we were seeing returns that caught the attention of the investment community. The interesting thing was that my investment philosophy was actually better than the one I'd been taught at MCD. My filter wasn't just about maximum returns or disruption for disruption's sake.
It was about impact.
It was about sustainable business models. It was about founding teams that I believed in, not just company pitch decks. And it turned out that this philosophy actually made for better investments. By the time Lucas was 7 years old, Miles Capital had closed its third fund. We had $250 million under management. We were getting national press. I was being interviewed for articles about women in venture capital. I was being asked to speak at conferences. I had become exactly what I wanted to become, a successful venture capitalist. And I had done it without Richard Chen, without MCD, without any of them. But here's the thing about success. If the people who hurt you don't know about it, what does it matter? If they're not watching you succeed, if they're not realizing what they gave up when they fired you, then what's the point? And I realized that I still carried this anger toward MCD, this sense of injustice, the knowledge that I had been discriminated against and that the company had never acknowledged it, never apologized for it. Richard Chun had gone on to other success. He left MCD about 5 years after he fired me. He started his own consulting firm. From everything I could see, he didn't think about me. He didn't wonder what happened to me. He had moved on completely. And I couldn't move on. I was stuck in some way, still fighting that battle from the past, still carrying that wound. And then, about 3 years ago, I heard that MCD was struggling. The company had lost some of its founders. The new leadership wasn't as strong. Their recent exits weren't generating the returns that they had promised investors. The company that had once seemed untouchable, the company that had once defined success for me, was beginning to fail. I started paying attention. I started following their deal activity. I started thinking about what they were doing wrong. And I realized something. This was a company worth saving. Despite everything they had done to me, despite the culture that had led to my firing, the company's fundamental business model was sound. They had just lost their way. They needed new leadership. They needed a vision for what they could become. And then it occurred to me, what if I could buy that company? What if I could take Miles Capital's resources and acquire MCD? What if I could make that company into something better? What if I could walk back into the place that destroyed me, but this time as the owner? Acquiring MCD took 8 months. It wasn't easy. There were complexities. The current owners didn't want to sell to me specifically, though looking back, I wonder if they sensed something. I went through intermediaries. I used holding companies. I kept my involvement quiet. I wanted it to be a surprise. The financial side was the easiest part. Miles Capital had the capital. MCD had been struggling long enough that their valuation was significantly lower than it had been. We put together a consortium of investors. We made an offer. The board accepted. The announcement came out on a Tuesday morning. Miles Capital, in partnership with 3 other investment firms, had acquired Meridian Capital Group. The deal valued the company at $75 million. Victoria Miles, founder and CEO of Miles Capital, would assume the role of CEO of the newly formed entity, MCD Miles Capital. The press release didn't make a big deal about my personal history with the company. But within hours, people started putting the pieces together. People at MCD who remembered me. People in the investment community who knew my story. Calls started coming in. Emails. People who had worked with me at MCD who suddenly reached out with congratulations that felt more like condolences for the company. My first day as CEO of MCD Miles Capital, I walked into the office. The same office that had fired me 11 years earlier. The same building. The same desks. The same conference room where I had been told I didn't have the commitment this job required. I didn't make a big announcement. I didn't stand up in front of everyone and say, "Look at me now. I'm back and I own this place." That would have been too easy, too obvious. Instead, I went to my new office, what had been the founding partner's office, and I sat down at the desk and I got to work. Within the first week, I instituted new policies. Flexible work arrangements. Remote work options. Parental leave for both mothers and fathers. On-site childcare. These weren't radical policies by 2024 standards, but for an investment firm, they were revolutionary. I created a diversity and inclusion committee. I established a mentorship program specifically designed to help women and people of color advance within the firm. I didn't make any of these changes vindicatively or with the explicit goal of dismantling the culture that had hurt me. But that was the effect. Every policy I implemented was a direct response to the ways that MCD had failed me. Every initiative I created was designed to prevent what happened to me from happening to anyone else. Some of the old guard hated these changes. There were partners who left because they couldn't adapt to the new culture. There were people who resisted the idea that work-life balance was important. But there were also people who were relieved, who appreciated the new direction, who felt liberated by the idea that you could be successful at an investment firm and also have a life outside of work. Richard Chin called me about 2 months after I took over. We hadn't spoken in 11 years. He wanted to congratulate me on the acquisition. He wanted to tell me how impressive he thought my success was. He wanted to tell me that he was proud of how I'd turned out. I listened to him, and then I said, "Richard, do you remember firing me?" There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said, "Victoria, that was a long time ago. That was a different time, a different company." I said, "I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember sitting in your office. I remember you telling me I had competing priorities, that I couldn't handle this job and a baby at the same time. I remember feeling like my worth as a professional had been erased the moment I became a mother." Richard said, "Victoria, I'm sorry if you felt that way, but we were trying to do what was best for the company." And I said, "No, you were trying to do what was best for yourself. You wanted someone who would sacrifice everything for the job the way you had. Someone without a family. Someone without anything that mattered more than work. And when you realized I wasn't going to be that person, you got rid of me." And then I hung up. That was the only acknowledgement I ever got. Not an apology. Not real accountability. Just a defensive conversation with a man who couldn't even admit what he'd done. But that was okay. Because I didn't need his acknowledgement. I didn't need his permission or his forgiveness. I had already moved past him. I had already become something he could never be. Within the first year of my ownership, MCD Miles Capital was generating better returns than MCD had generated in the 5 years before. My investment philosophy, the one I had developed at Miles Capital, was working. We were finding better companies. We were making smarter bets. We were building a portfolio that wasn't just profitable, but also innovative and purposeful. But the financial success was secondary to what I really cared about. I cared about the culture. I cared about creating an environment where people, especially women, could build meaningful careers without having to choose between ambition and humanity. An environment where having a family didn't make you a liability. Where taking parental leave didn't derail your trajectory. Where your value as a professional wasn't determined by your willingness to sacrifice your entire personal life. I hired women into leadership positions. Real leadership positions. Not token women placed in roles to satisfy diversity metrics. I hired women with families. Women who had taken breaks from their careers. Women who had been overlooked by the old boys network because they didn't fit the mold of what a successful venture capitalist looked like. I hired my replacement for the role I had held before I was fired. A woman named Jenna Fogger. Jenna was a brilliant analyst. She had been passed over for promotions at her previous firm because she wanted to have kids. MCD had rejected her application years earlier. I brought her on, and she became one of our best partners. And last year, at age 35, she made partner. Full partner. The path that had been blocked for me was now open for her. 3 years after I took over MCD Miles Capital, I was asked to speak at the same conference where I had met Marcus all those years ago. The conference where I met the man who would give me Lucas, whose birth would change everything. I was asked to speak about women in venture capital, about creating inclusive workplaces, about how business success doesn't have to come at the expense of human connection and personal well-being. I accepted. And I told my story. I told thousands of people in that auditorium about being fired for being pregnant, about the shame and rage and desperation I felt. About how I started Miles Capital from my home office while pumping breast milk. About how I came back and bought the company that had destroyed me. But I also told them about the lessons I learned. About how the company I created because of that pain and injustice became infinitely better than the company I had built it in response to. And I said something that I want to repeat here because I think it's important. I said, the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy. The best revenge is becoming so successful, so excellent, so fundamentally superior in every way that your enemy becomes irrelevant. It's building something better. It's creating a world where what happened to you never happens to anyone else. It's taking your pain and transforming it into purpose. After my speech, a line of women came up to me. Women who had been fired for being pregnant. Women who had their opportunities taken from them because they were mothers. Women who had left their careers because the system made it impossible to stay. And they told me that my story gave them hope. That seeing what I had built gave them permission to imagine a different future. That's when I really understood what I had done. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving myself to Richard Chen or anyone else who had doubted me. It was about creating a world where fewer women would have to go through what I went through. It was about using my success not as a weapon but as a model, as proof that it's possible to be ambitious and have a family, to be excellent at your work and also be a real mother and wife, to not have to choose. MCD Miles Capital is now the most profitable investment fund in Colorado. We've closed 4 successful funds. We manage over $1 billion in assets. We've founded companies that have gone public. We've created jobs. We've generated wealth. But more importantly, we've created a culture where people are valued as complete human beings, not just as workers. And Lucas is 14 now. He's smart and kind, and he has interests outside of just achievement. He knows that his mother is successful, but he also knows that she's present, that she shows up for his soccer games when possible, that she makes time for our family, that being ambitious doesn't mean you have to be absent, that you can have both, that you don't have to choose. When I was fired from MCD, I thought that was the worst thing that could happen to me. I thought my career was over. I thought that once you were pushed out of the investment world for being a mother, there was no coming back. I thought I was finished. But being fired was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because of how it turned out, though the outcomes have been extraordinary, but because it forced me to fundamentally reconsider who I was and what I wanted. It forced me to stop measuring my worth by someone else's standard. It forced me to stop seeking approval from people like Richard Chen. It forced me to build something that was authentically mine. I think about that moment in Richard's office all the time. I think about the devastation I felt, the sense of betrayal, the feeling that the rules had changed the moment I became a mother. And I'm grateful for it now. Grateful for the pain. Because that pain led me to something better. That pain led me to create Miles Capital. That pain led me to build something that changed the industry. But here's what I want to be clear about. I'm not grateful because I got my revenge. I'm not grateful because I got to buy the company and show everyone that I was right. I'm grateful because pain, when it's processed and transformed, becomes wisdom. And wisdom is more valuable than revenge. The day that I walked back into MCD as the owner, I had a choice. I could have used that power to punish the people who hurt me. I could have fired people. I could have dismantled the systems that led to my firing. I could have been cruel to those who had been cruel to me. But I didn't. And not because I'm a saint or because I'm above it, but because I realized that cruelty wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't change what happened to me. It wouldn't make me less hurt. What fixed me was building something better. What healed me was creating a place where what happened to me became impossible. What transformed my pain into purpose was using my success to change the industry. I want to say something to anyone watching this who has been discriminated against. Whether it's because you're a mother or because of your gender, your race, your age, your disabilities, or any other reason. I want to say, what happened to you is not your fault. It is not a reflection of your worth. It is not a true measure of your capabilities. What happened to you is a reflection of a broken system. A system that was built to exclude you. A system that wasn't designed to accommodate people like you. And the fact that you were hurt by that system doesn't mean you're weak. It means the system is broken. But here's what I also know. You have more power than you think. The people who fired me didn't take away my intelligence. They didn't take away my instincts. They didn't take away my ability to create something. They only thought they did. They thought that by firing me, they were eliminating me as a threat or a problem. But what they actually did was release me. They freed me to build something that was entirely my own. So, if you're in a situation where someone has told you that you're not enough, I'm here to tell you, they're wrong. They're not seeing you accurately. They're seeing you through the lens of their own limitations. Your value is not determined by their judgment. Your worth is not dependent on their approval. What you can do is build something better. What you can do is use your pain as fuel. What you can do is create a world that works for people like you. What you can do is become so undeniably excellent that the system has to change to accommodate you. And when you do that, you change it not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Richard Chen will probably never fully understand what he did when he fired me. He'll probably never understand how his decision to discard me set me on a path that led me to something greater than anything I could have accomplished if he had let me stay. And that's okay. He doesn't need to understand it. I understand it. And that's enough. The last time I saw Richard, it was at an industry event. We spoke briefly. He asked me how I was doing. I told him I was doing well. Very well. He asked me about Lucas. I told him he was thriving. That he was 14 and in high school and doing well academically, but also that he played soccer and he spent time with his friends and that he had a life outside of just achievement. And Richard just smiled. He didn't understand what I was really telling him, that his greatest fear, that having a child would derail my career, was unfounded, that I could be both an excellent mother and an excellent professional, that I had not had to choose, that I had gotten both. 11 years ago, I was told that I wasn't valuable anymore, that my worth to a company had been erased by motherhood, that I had to choose between being a professional and being a parent. That decision changed my life. It didn't destroy me, though it felt like it would for a very long time. Instead, it liberated me. I'm not going to tell you that everything worked out perfectly. I'm not going to tell you that there was a magical moment where I suddenly felt better about what happened. There wasn't. For years, I carried anger and resentment and a sense of injustice about the way I was treated. But I channeled that anger into building something, into creating something that proved, without me having to say it, that I was more than enough. And now, when women come to me and tell me about being discriminated against at work, about being fired or pushed out or overlooked because they're mothers or because they want to have families, I tell them my story. Not because I'm suggesting they go out and buy the company that hurt them. That's not realistic for most people. I'm telling them my story because it's evidence that injustice is not the final word. That being hurt doesn't have to be your ending. That the people who hurt you don't get to define your future. What I did was specific to my circumstances. I had access to capital. I had connections in the investment industry. I had luck. But what you can do is applicable to your life, whatever your circumstances are. You can decide that what someone else thinks about you doesn't get to be your truth. You can decide to build something that's entirely yours. You can decide to create change in whatever sphere you occupy. Maybe you're a teacher who's been overlooked for promotion because you have kids. Create a classroom where students see that their teachers are real people with real lives. Where education is about more than just grades. Where being human is valued alongside being accomplished. That's building something better. Maybe you're a nurse who's been passed over for leadership positions because people assume you're not committed enough. Create a culture on your floor where people are treated with humanity, where shifts are flexible, where the well-being of the staff is prioritized alongside patient care. That's building something better. Maybe you're just someone who's been hurt and you're trying to figure out how to move forward. Start there. Start with small acts of intentional creation. Start with building the world you wish had existed for you. And let that world expand. Let it grow. And eventually, it might become something that changes everything. Here's what I know at 42 that I didn't know at 31. The people who hurt us are usually not as brilliant as we imagine them to be. They're usually just limited. Limited in their imagination. Limited in their ability to see people as complete human beings. Limited in their understanding of what's possible. And when we accept their limitations as truth, we limit ourselves unnecessarily. So, I'm asking you to do something. I'm asking you to not accept their limitations. I'm asking you to imagine something bigger. I'm asking you to decide that you're going to build something better. Not out of revenge, but out of purpose. Not to destroy what exists, but to create what should exist. And if you're a person in power, if you're a manager, a leader, a person who makes hiring and firing decisions, I'm asking you to think about Victoria from 11 years ago. Think about a talented, ambitious woman who was discriminated against because she became a mother. Think about all the potential that was lost because the system wasn't built to accommodate her full humanity. Think about how much better your organization would be if you created a culture where people could be whole, where ambition and humanity weren't mutually exclusive, where success didn't require sacrifice of everything that makes life worth living. Think about that. This is Victoria Miles. I'm the CEO of MCD Miles Capital. I'm the founder of Miles Capital. I'm a venture capitalist and a mother and a wife and a person who was once told she wasn't enough. And I'm here to tell you that the people who told me that were wrong. They were so catastrophically wrong. And maybe they still don't understand that. But I do. And I hope you do too. If this story resonated with you, if you've been hurt by a system that wasn't built for you, I want to hear about it. I want to know how you're rebuilding. I want to hear about the thing you're creating in the comment. Because that's where the real story is. Not in the revenge. Not in the return. But in what you build after the fall. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that it's possible to come back from this kind of betrayal. Thank you for imagining a better world with me.
And if you love real-life stories with tough choices, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.